This is our October MIT Alumni Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network webinar. Our umbrella group tries to introduce different ideas and education about some of the issues involved with either clean energy or environment or how much sustainability we can actually get to soon. So it really is an umbrella group. It's not kind of a group on its own. We are always working with other groups of alums, whether they're in their MIT clubs or their affinity groups. If there's an issue on sustainability and climate, we want to know about it. We want to put it in our list. We list them on our homepage. We have them in our list of events. And we hope that you all can come to the webpage on the alumni community and sign up, join in, that kind of thing. And that way you'll be on our mailing list, which is a once a month update and a reminder during the middle of the month. But we try to, and we also appreciate any kind of news about alums who are doing work in our area. We were founded 15 years ago. At that time, America didn't say climate, we said global warming. And that's why our name doesn't include climate. But in some ways, sustainability and circular economies is a little broader topic than just saying climate, where it's perhaps more understandable to a lot of people in the United States anyway. So with that, I'd like to kick off the webinar by asking our two panelists, David Cohen Tanugi and Francesco Sciortino, to introduce themselves, and they'll give some presentations. We will be looking through your questions and answers. I believe the chat is turned off for you today. This is a webinar, but we did have those questions ahead of time. So we'll be able to respond to some of that and some live questions depending upon what we have to say. So David, if you would please take over at this point. Have a good, I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for hosting us, and it's very nice to be seeing all of you. My name is David Cohen Tanugi, and I'm a 2015 alum from the PhD program in MIT Course 3, which is Materials Science and Engineering. After spending about 10 years as an entrepreneur after my graduate studies, I rejoined MIT to work with MIT Proto Ventures. MIT Proto Ventures is MIT's new venture studio program on campus. And there I spent the last 2.5 years leading the fusion and clean energy division. Currently, I also work with Pine Island New Energy Partners, which is an investment fund focused on the supply chain for clean firm power and grid modernization. That's a little bit about me. Over to you, Francesco.
Thanks, David. Great to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Francesco Sciortino. I'm co-founder and CEO of Proxima Fusion, originally from Italy, and I graduated from MIT Physics with a PhD in 2021. After MIT, I joined the Max Planck Society, an organization of national labs in Germany. And in 2023, I co-founded the company that I've been working ever since with, and that I'll be telling you a little bit about. Voila, without further ado, I'll share my screen and start telling you a little bit about fusion. So David and I are going to give a little bit of a view on various aspects of fusion. I will begin with an introduction, then tell you a bit about stellarators, the specific fusion concept that Proxima Fusion works on. And then David will take it over and expand the view, looking at supply chain and commercialization. So the reason why we're pursuing fusion, I suspect people are all well familiar with. We've been pursuing the power of the stars for a good part of 6 decades. And the ability to build a star on Earth has fascinated a lot of people for a long time. But this is going beyond fascination, let's say, looking for a clean energy source that is effectively clean, basically inexhaustive, impossible. The amount of fuel is infinite, and it's safe. Indeed, if we were to unlock fusion for humanity on Earth, we could get a lot of good things done. So first of all, this is an opportunity for massive decarbonization. We're looking at a source of baseload power that could complement the intermittent renewables that we're already deploying today. So fusion is not an alternative, or at least we don't want to frame it as just an alternative to solar and wind and so on. We want to complement those sources of energy, looking to balance the grid. The importance of that is often underestimated. Every clean energy grid today is suffering from the complexity of avoiding fossil fuels. And of course, fusion is an alternative to fission and geothermal and other sources that are clean and that fit in different scenarios. I'll come back to some of that. On top of massive decarbonization, some of the themes that are now exciting new ecosystems with fusion, one of those themes is energy security and sovereignty. I'm myself based in Germany, at the heart of Europe, and the theme of energy security is really at the core of what we discuss with politicians, with the public. The idea of having in a country an energy source that you can control, where the fuel is basically inexhaustible, and where you can have the technology stack that you rely on actually within the same geopolitical area. This has become very important. And of course, nobody would be surprised to hear that the expansion of AI and the creation of new data centers, some of them really, really large, this is one of the drives now for the deployment of further fission and also fusion. So these AI centers are now consuming ever more power, and we'd like that to be clean power. So we're in a phase where fusion has the opportunity, is seen more and more often as an opportunity to decouple wealth and natural resources. So instead of having a world where power is effectively controlled by those that have the ability to pump out things from the ground, instead we're looking at technology giants being in control of the future. And you can really see fusion as basically the next step in the evolution of not just humanity, but also energy. As humanity, we started basically with leveraging the power of muscles, whether from humans themselves or from animals. And the energy density, so how much energy you can get per volume of mass or volume of space, was really low. We then went through the Industrial Revolution, where the density of that energy has increased by, depending on how you count, a factor of 1,000, let's say. That's the phase in which we learned about chemical bonds and how to break them, how to leverage them to move things in general. Next phase was, you can say, the modern era or the atomic age, and the split of the atom, so the technology at the basis of fission, increased the energy density of that humanity could access by a factor of 1,000,000. So the splitting of the atom is an incredible thing that science, that we've understood in science. The technology to split the atom came, of course, already in the, depending on when you start counting, the 20s, 30s, 40s. We first leveraged it through atomic weapons, but then quickly we realized how to use fission for energy production in a safe way. Fusion has taken a whole lot longer, but fusion is the evolution of that naturally. It's, first of all, more energy dense, but it's also safer. There is no chain reaction, as I'll describe. So humanity will get to fusion. That's not in question. We're trying to see how fast can we get it, how economic can we make it, what's the commercial case that will determine how far fusion will spread in the energy production system. So fusion and fission, maybe good to pause for a second and distinguish. Fission is what you see on the left, and fusion is what's on the right. In fission, we are splitting the atom. Usually these atoms of interest are large. So we're talking about uranium, plutonium, and similar. We have an incident neutron, so a neutral particle that splits the atom, and that forms lighter nuclei. And importantly, in this process, we create new neutrons, and there is a chain reaction, meaning that more neutrons can go out and trigger new fission reactions. So this is a process that is, in some sense, fantastically easy. Fission, you can think of as a marvel of science, where you have two rocks that are particularly well suited for fission, you bring them close together and they start getting hot. This is a natural process, and it's just nothing short of magical. But it has its complexities, which I don't think I have to introduce here. But fission is somewhat difficult to control. We've developed technology to control it, but has associated complexity in social acceptance because of its history. In fusion, we are in a completely different space. So we're looking at the lightest atoms that exist, basically heavy forms of hydrogen. We refer to them as deuterium and tritium. And by smashing them as hard as we can overcome the barriers that normally hold atoms away from each other. When they collide so hard, they can fuse. And in the fusion process from deuterium and tritium, we can get helium, which is slightly heavier, but still a very light particle, an inert particle that doesn't harm anyone. In fact, if we made enough of it, we could sell it. And then we produce a neutron. Not that we produce one neutron, and that means there is no chain reaction. So the reaction has to be we need to keep feeding deuterium and tritium that can fuse at high energy. This reaction also produces a lot of energy. In both cases, in fact, we have a lot of energy. As I said, in fusion, more compared to fission in an energy density sense. And that energy basically comes from transforming part of the mass into pure thermal energy. So the fundamentals here are represented by the Einstein formula, E equals mc squared. And basically, that is the basis of both fission and fusion. But fission, as I said, we've managed to leverage quite a long time ago. Fusion, we managed to make weapons with. That's what an H-bomb is. But controlling fusion and leveraging it for peaceful energy purposes has taken us a lot longer. So we're talking about fusion 6 decades, roughly, after we really started going with research. And of course, the question is, how long more is it going to take us? We'll come back to that. But we are in a very different place where we were just 10 years ago even. Now we have a growing fusion industry. This says more than 6 billion of private investment. That is quite outdated, actually. It's more than 10, or depending on how you count, you could say even more. But there is now a wealth of fusion companies around the world. Many of the ones that are represented here are in the United States. The largest of these companies is Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which, given that this is an MIT alumni event, it's worth mentioning CFS is also an MIT spin-out. And among all of these companies, these are very non-theoretical ideas, you could say. We are building things, and regardless of which fusion religion you choose, there are several companies that are really getting things done. And the probability of none of them being right starts shrinking with time. So it's okay to be skeptic in fusion, but the reality is stuff is happening. So I'm going to focus a little bit on those that I consider quite in a biased way, what are the leading fusion concepts. And those are tokamaks and stellarators. Both of these are magnetic confinement fusion systems. And MIT actually has had a historical research group at the now Plasma Science and Fusion Center working on both tokamaks and more recently expanding on stellarators. In fact, when I got to MIT, there was a tokamak on the MIT campus called Alcator CMOD, and that was the largest experiment on the MIT campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A tokamak is what you see here on the left. It's effectively like a donut, but you could also call it an apple. It's a thing that has a long direction around, and we're trying to create hot ionized matter, heavy hydrogen forms, as I mentioned, in a donut-like shape. I say that it's a bit like an apple because it has a core. So just like an apple has a central part, in a tokamak, you have this central part that goes from the top to the bottom, and that is what is called a transformer. And that transformer creates a large current in the long direction of the hot ionized matter, which we call a plasma. So what you're seeing here is basically an ecosystem of magnets with cryogenic systems to keep the magnets superconducting. There is a vacuum vessel, there are support structures. It's really very multidisciplinary, which is why generations of fusion engineers have found this topic so interesting. But of course, we're trying to get it to actual energy, not just to research. On the right-hand side, you see an alternative, which is a stellarator. The stellarator is analogous in that it's like a donut with magnets, and we're trying to confine a plasma. So what's pink on the left is a plasma, what's pink on the right is also a plasma. The difference between the left and the right is, yes, there is a big hole in the center on the right, but also you see that the plasma here is twisty. Actually, the magnets themselves, which is this gray, some of the gray things that you're seeing here, are also twisty. They are in a 3-dimensional shape. Now, the absence of the core of the apple, so what you see on the left as the core being absent on the right, that means that we're not creating intentionally a current in the plasma in the long direction. That has big implications. It means that the thing on the right turns out to be much harder to design. I could also say it's much harder to manufacture. The reason why we would go and take on all that trouble, let's say, is because the thing on the right is much simpler to operate. So the question is, can you design a stellarator, the thing on the right, to accomplish many optimization metrics using supercomputers and then get a similar performance to the tokamak, but in a much simpler to operate device? So stellarators are naturally steady state. They can continue operate in continuous operation, like a power plant, the baseload power plant of the future that we want. They can also be optimized to be intrinsically stable, but we have to show that we can bring them to a high performance. Then the magnet technology is very central. So an analogy that I like to make about tokamaks and stellarators is that tokamaks are a bit like an helicopter, whereas a stellarator is more like an airplane. An helicopter is a device that works, which we rely on in society in many ways, but it has to fly close to the ground. And if you lose control, if you leave your hands from the controls, you're pretty certain to go down to the ground very quickly. So it's a device that you have to control very actively, and it's used for short flights. That's an analogy to the fact that tokamaks are always pulsed. They have a start, you run them for some time, and then you have to ramp them down and then repeat. Whereas a stellarator can operate in steady state, in continuous operation, so it's a longer flight, and it's a stable flight. If you know how to ramp up, if you've designed it right, you manufactured it right, you ramp up, then it's aerodynamically stable. It can run by itself. As a pilot, you could take off your hands from the control, and the thing should just go. And you have to know how to ramp it down as well, how to land, let's say. So the analogy carries over to how we think we can operate both a tokamak and a stellarator in fusion power plants. So what does a stellarator really look like? I'm going to break it down in the layers, let's say. In this drawing here, this is the W7X stellarator that is in Germany within the Max Planck Society that Proxima spun out from. This is the most advanced stellarator in the world, and you'll see why in a second. It all starts from a twisty plasma that is 5-fold symmetric, and to confine this hot ionized matter in a power plant at 150 million degrees, you have to add magnets. These magnets are superconducting, meaning that they don't have any losses, but you have to keep them at cryogenic conditions. As you see, these magnets are twisty, they are weirdly shaped, and that shape is numerically optimized. Then you add more magnets, you add cables, structures. The forces on this kind of device are enormous. Then you add a cryostat with many ports in the case of W7X so that we can measure what is happening in the plasma in so many locations. And once you close it up, depending on what kind of flavor of engineering you like, this is either horrendous or amazing. I'm definitely in the category of people that thinks that this is amazing. And when you close it up and you look at what W7X really looks like, if you come to Greifswald in the north of Germany, you would see something like that. This is probably one of the most visionary engineering projects humanity has ever pulled off. I think that's safe to say. This costed about $1.5 billion to the German government, to the European Union. But actually, there is a big contribution also by the United States. For example, this yellow magnets here, there are several around the device that was contributed by researchers funded by the Department of Energy. So there is a bit of lots of research from around the world in this device. And what we did as Proxima Fusion when we started is take the concept of W7X, which is fundamentally stable. It can run for many minutes, but with magnets that are not as powerful as the ones that we can do today. We took that concept, we upgraded the magnets in our designs, we optimized the entire device to then have a concept for a power plant. That's what you see on the right-hand side. This is what we call Stellaris. We published it in February, earlier this year, and we decided to publish it so that the world could tell that we're now, as humanity, able to numerically optimize a thing like this, which we believe has no skeletons in the closet, meets a coherent set of constraints from the physics, the engineering, and the commercial side. I'll show you a brief video so you can see what are the key components of Stellaris. So that work on Stellaris was the result of about a year of work together with the Max Planck Society. And it's really the result of a stellarator community working for 6 decades across the world. And this was very generously described by Dennis White, at the time the director of the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center, as one of the biggest developments in fusion technology of the past decade. Worth mentioning that Dennis White was a co-founder of Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which derived from the previous breakthrough a decade before, coming in the world of tokamaks and resulting in CFS. So after publishing this concept that we called Stellaris, our perspective as Proxima Fusion was, now we have shown that there is a coherent way forward, no clear roadblocker from the physics side, and now we've shown that we can build the engineering ecosystem that makes sense around this plasma concept. So Proxima today is about 100 team members. We are based in Munich, Zurich, and Oxford across Europe. We've raised about $230 million of private and public financing. And as I said, we published that work so that the world knows that there is a path forward and we have to pursue it, partly on engineering systems for the whole stellarators, but particularly on high-temperature superconducting magnets. With that, I'll hand over to David, and thanks everyone for the attention.
Excellent. I'm going to share screen as well. There we go. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Good morning or afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're located. I am David Cohen Tanugi, and I am the venture builder for fusion and clean energy at MIT. I'm really excited to follow up on Francesco's exciting presentation to share reflections and kind of perspectives on the path to get to fusion energy, specifically with an emphasis on why fusion energy matters, why this effort is ongoing, and what it may take, what it's going to take to get commercial fusion energy on the grid and powering this planet. So for context, I mentioned I am with MIT Proto Ventures. MIT Proto Ventures is MIT's new venture studio program. We are on campus and we combine translation expertise and technology expertise to identify, build, and ultimately launch impactful, world-changing new startups that are inspired by MIT research, technology, people, and ideas, and crucially, that wouldn't have happened or existed without us. Okay, so I'll start out by kind of piggybacking off of Francesco's presentation and talking a little bit about why fusion matters. As many of you know, global electricity demand is soaring. It's been growing in past years and decades, and that has continued, that has actually increased. The pace of electricity demand growth has increased and is expected to keep growing in coming decades. And that is not driven only by AI data centers, but also by many other factors, such as population growth, increase in rising living standards, which result in greater energy consumption, and the electrification of many sectors like transportation, heating, and so on and so forth. There's a growing consensus that the world needs now clean, firm electricity sources that can complement solar and wind. And when I say firm, essentially I mean forms of electricity that can be counted upon, and turned on and turned off and ramped up and ramped down, kind of on demand as needed. Solar and wind are clean and renewable and have come down dramatically in cost over the last couple of decades, but they are variable in ways that don't always match the timing of electricity demand in a particular location. In that context, fusion energy promises many advantages that could make it a really fantastic source of clean, firm power to complement renewable energy. In particular, it emits no CO2 or particulates during operation. It has very high power density, either per volume or per kind of square footage of kind of power plant facility. It has very good siting flexibility, meaning that you should be able to place a fusion power plant anywhere, including in areas that are not particularly rich in natural resources, including next to urban population centers, and so on and so forth. And at least today, fusion benefits from very strong societal acceptance. most people don't know too much about fusion, but insofar, if you poll kind of folks and you ask a little bit about fusion in general, to the extent that they know anything, people are favorably inclined. And one can compare that with nuclear fission, and I think we all know what societal acceptance or lack thereof can do to the prospects of a technology. So essentially, that's why fusion, because the world needs an economical, clean, firm power source, and that fusion has a very good shot at being it, or being one of those sources. So having established that, I want to talk a little bit about the path to get there. And I'll start with the million-dollar question that is on everybody's mind, which is, when are we actually going to get fusion energy? Now, nobody can predict the future, including myself, but we can make some educated estimates by studying and learning from the history of other technological fields that in some ways are similar to fusion, or at least where there's kind of parallels, and that have transformed our society. And commercial aviation is actually a good example for educational purposes here. So in this table, I've taken in the first row kind of the really simplified history of commercial aviation. And in the second and third rows, I'm showing the kind of histories to date and kind of potential roadmaps, either stated targets or when there's no stated target, my best estimate, if you will, of Commonwealth fusion systems and Proxima Fusion. So let's start with commercial aviation. The concept of flight and of airplanes in one way or another had been around forever, pretty much, but it was really with the development of the warped wing as a key enabling component and by the Wright brothers and others in the 1900s that the field of aviation really got started. And that translated, interestingly, relatively quickly into a full proof of concept device by the Wright brothers, shown here. And about a decade later, into what you might call a first of a kind, fully functional, albeit not necessarily economically viable, aircraft in the 1910s. And then you have to kind of skip to the 1950s with the Boeing 707 to get to a place where commercial aviation becomes economically viable, commercially viable. And even then, I'll note that it remained a relatively niche way of getting around. Finally, about 2 decades after that, the Boeing 747 really kind of symbolizes the full market transformation where airplanes are mainstream mode of transport. So what can we learn from that? How might that map onto fusion? Well, let's take again 2 exciting fusion startup developer companies, Commonwealth Fusion Systems and Proxima Fusion, as examples. So their sound concepts were articulated generally in the last 10 years, 2025 for the Stellarators paper in the context of Proxima, 2014 for the ARC original concept and publication associated simulations. These are, again, the kind of initial landmarks that showed that there was a proposed design and that proposed design was theoretically viable and performant. The next step for both companies has been the demonstration of a key enabling component, namely in both cases in model superconducting coil. CFS achieved their version of that with Spark in 2021 on the MIT campus, and as I understand it, Proxima is working on essentially something that is similar in a lot of ways, and that is slated to be complete in the next 2 years. So this is more or less where we are today, give or take a little bit. Both CFS and Proxima are then targeting a proof of concept facility called Spark in the context of CFS, Alpha in the context of Proxima, that achieves net energy gain, so more energy produced by the plasma and the fusion reaction than what goes in at the level of the plasma, but doesn't necessarily produce any electricity in the late 2020s or early 2030s. So we're in this column. From there, the stated target in both cases is to build the first few power plants, which may not be economical, mind you, in the 2030s. And extending the analogy to commercial aviation, an optimistic guess would be that we'll start seeing a full fleet of power plants that are commercially viable thanks to advanced materials, new components, a variety of optimizations and obviously economies of scale in the 40s. And finally, fusion as a not just a niche thing that's been demonstrated with 1 or 2 or 10 plants, but really a meaningful part of global energy in the 2060s and beyond. So this is again a forecast, but it gives some plausible, optimistic sense of what we might see. And it's actually consistent with what MIT's recent study on the role of fusion in a decarbonized electricity system has kind of expected or modeled out. This is straight from this MIT study, and what we can see in these plots in all cases is the breakdown of electricity supply by source of electricity from 2020 to a kind of projected 2100. And the reason we're seeing 4 plots is it's 4 different cost scenarios for the overnight capital costs of fusion. And fusion is the kind of pink wedge in all cases. And what you can see, forget about the difference between all of them, is in all cases, the pink wedge opens right around 2050. So you can really start noticing fusion making a big dent and a big impact in the electricity system in 2050-ish and making increasingly more impact through the rest of that century. And what you'll also see here is that depending on how optimistic you are about the overnight capital costs of a fusion power plant, ranging from $2,800 per kilowatt all the way to $11,000 per kilowatt, you see fusion either taking over and kind of meeting about half of the world's electricity needs to only about 10%, something like that. So it depends one way or the other. In my remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about the fusion supply chain. Francesco has mentioned this, and he's absolutely right. Fusion has entered a completely new era now, one that is no longer about research and development and science and even just engineering, but really a commercial development era with billions of dollars invested at this point, dozens of companies competing to be the first to build a full fusion power plant. Of course, to grow into a mature industry, the fusion sector is going to need a whole lot more than just integrator companies that want to build a power plant. It's going to need a robust supply chain of vendors to sell to those integrators. Here at MIT, we found that the answer to the biggest gaps and the biggest opportunities was not so clear. And so we set out to address these questions in a report that was published recently and that I'll point to at the end of this presentation. As we mapped out the fusion market today, we found essentially a plethora of private companies that are aiming to commercialize a power plant design, what we're calling integrators. So in the aviation analogy, picture the Boeing and Airbus type companies, and really very few vendors that are available to support those integrators with specific components, services, subsystems, and so on. And what emerged from our research is a vision for a potential future where there's only a handful of fusion integrators, so a lot of consolidation, and a much more robust ecosystem of vendors and partners that are supplying the goods and services necessary for a full fusion energy system. Generally speaking, the specific opportunities that we identified fell into 5 buckets. Fusion materials first, components and consumables, then full subsystems, software, services, and facilities, and finally, financial and human capital and other kind of non-technical areas of the supply chain. In the interest of time, I'm not going to describe all of those opportunities today, but I will point to you at the end to the report that includes all of them. So I'll tell you a little bit about fusion materials. Beyond the pilot stage that we're kind of in today, most experts agree that many of the materials that are required for commercially viable fusion power plants don't exist fully today. And in particular, the fusion industry is going to need the following. It's going to need vendors for plasma-facing materials, so essentially the first layer that is closest to the plasma, that are capable of withstanding a fusion environment on commercial timescales. So commercial timescales is decades in the presence of radiation fields, heat, mechanical stresses, and so on and so forth. Essentially the somewhat intense environment that is inherent to fusion, and crucially that are mass manufacturable. Next, the fusion industry is also going to need advanced structural materials in order to construct vacuum vessels, molten salt blankets, piping, and so on. And this is going to require not just new material chemistries and new alloys, but also new fabrication techniques and new assembly techniques. Superconducting materials will be essential for not all, but most fusion concepts, at least pretty much all magnetic confinement fusion concepts, such as the one that Francesco told us about with Proxima. And crucially, those superconducting materials will need to come down in cost and will need to maintain their performance under irradiation, which is not entirely a given today. And finally, for any concept that requires on deuterium and tritium, so heavy forms of hydrogen as the primary fuel, tritium permeation barriers will be needed that can prevent the leakage of tritium across components, for example, in coolant channel piping or in heat exchanger services. I'll give one more example of a kind of subchapter of supply chain opportunities and needs on the path to commercial fusion, and that is subsystems. So while the plasma producing heart, if you will, of a fusion power plant will typically be developed in-house by the integrator company, I think that's more or less part of the strategic plan for all or nearly all the fusion companies, there may several major subsystems that are actually excellent fits for third-party providers. And these ancillary subsystems, such as the fuel cycle or heat exchange, they'll be integral for plant operation, and it's most likely that they can be standardized to an extent across a multiple fusion concept and plant design. So one subsystem or kind of supply chain company may be able to act as the vendor for multiple integrators, much as the oil field services companies in the oil and gas space are able to offer kind of similar systems for a lot of the oil and gas majors. So in this case, what are we talking about specifically? Well, all deuterium and tritium concepts are going to need a fuel cycle, regardless of how they confine the fuel, the plasma, and that makes the fuel cycle a relatively concept-agnostic subsystem. And the essential parts of that system include vacuum pumps, separators, tritium extractors, isotope storage, hydrogen isotope storage, fueling systems, and instrumentation for keeping track of tritium, what people call tritium accountancy. Also next is plasma heating and current drive actuators that essentially heat the plasma, drive it, and that must be cost effective, have high power, high duty cycle, high efficiency, and be durable on the time scale of a commercial plant. Next up is heat exchange subsystems. Obviously, most power systems today, at least all thermal power plants, involve heat exchange of some sort. But here we're going to need somewhat bespoke heat exchange subsystems that are suited for the fusion industry. And in particular, they'll need to be capable of withstanding the effects of radiation, of high temperatures, while minimizing corrosion and somewhat specific to fusion, tritium permeation. Next on this list is cryogenic cooling systems. Again, this is something that exists in other areas. Cryogenics is luckily already a field, but this whole industry is going to have to optimize itself for the temperatures at which high temperature superconducting materials operate. And we're going to need cooling systems that are spatially compact and energy efficient in particular. And the last one I'll mention on this list, and this will be the last example in my presentation, is thermal storage. Thermal storage systems essentially let fusion power plants divert their heat output during times of high renewable production, when the sun's shining, the wind's blowing, in order to not export power on the grid at that time, but to store it in the form of heat, such that when the price of electricity rises because there is no more sun or no more wind, maybe at night, then that's when the time the power plant can be producing and selling electricity. Several kind of techno-economic studies have shown that integrated thermal storage is going to be an important component of any economically competitive fusion power plant. And yet today it's still a major supply chain gap that's going to require eventually specialized development. It's on the roadmap for everybody, but it's kind of further along and yet still crucial. So in this report that I've alluded to, called Enabling Commercial Fusion, we've articulated specific opportunities in other areas as well, but I'm not going to cover them today in the interest of time. And they're described in greater detail in this report, which you can access at either by going to protoventures.mit.edu/fusion report, or by scanning the QR code that's in the bottom right of your screen. Or honestly, if you just Google Enabling Commercial Fusion MIT, you should find it. So in summary, I would say that the path to get to fusion is an exciting one. Fusion really holds great promise as a clean, firm power source for the 21st century. And it's going to require significant scientific and engineering progress and prowess, and sustained financial investment and the growth really of an enabling supply chain to get there. So this is a big project and one that gets a lot of people, including myself, excited. Thank you. So I'm going to unshare screen. And
David.
Francesco, I believe we have some questions that have been coming in from the chat. Maybe you want to take the first one.
We have lots. It's fantastic. So I was answering some quickly, but then I think I would switch now to answering them live together. And maybe I will highlight a couple, both in terms of questions that we got ahead of time and some of the ones that are coming now and that I haven't quite answered yet. So one that is often asked is about the timeline. So David was addressing some of it, but I think this is one topic where the famous fusion is always 30 years away comes to mind to a lot of people. What I think both David and I were trying to convey is that we are now in a phase where there are private companies that are privately funded with people with a financial stake, believing that we are actually on a roadmap, which is neither quick nor cheap nor easy, but that it has a path to commercial viability. That is a different phase. And you could say that it's, 30 years is the time to the nth of a kind, maybe. Depends on how you look at which concept, which belief you choose to follow. But it is, I personally would say, and maybe David, please share your opinion if it's different, that we're not going to have a fusion power plant within the next 5 years. Most likely, we might have a first of a kind or possibly more than one within the next 10 years. But then, as David was saying, there is a learning curve in going from a first of a kind to an nth of a kind, and that will take the 2040s. And maybe with that, I connect to another question that has come, and I think on that one, it's interesting for you to share an opinion as well, David, which is how does this play together with the intermittent renewables that are already being deployed? On this one, I feel like it's important to really highlight. It's trying to think of fusion and solar and wind as in competition is fundamentally not very helpful, in the sense that these are very different kind of technologies in different geopolitical contexts, different contexts also of supply chains, and a number of other considerations have to be taken to understand when each source works. Right now, photovoltaics are fantastic. For example, their cost has gone down so much. We can still optimize a lot in terms of how we install them. We're expanding grids. And I think my personal expectation is that that will keep being a fantastically successful story. And that we maybe will come to an energy grid where 70, 80% will be photovoltaics plus grid expansion plus energy storage. To think about where fusion fits, you have to in some cases, the cost of all three. Nobody is ever going to beat the cost of a photovoltaics on somebody's roof. The production of a household in a sunny place is best done with a photovoltaic, probably plus some batteries for the time when the sun is not shining. The grid expansion makes considerations a little more expensive. Somebody has to pay for that grid expansion. But fusion is there to make sure that the costs will not balloon exponentially once you start looking at what the Germans call Dunkelflaute, time when there is no sun, no wind, and these times do come. You can create a massive interconnection of the grid, and we should do it. But then once you actually start looking at the numbers, or you ask a utility to do it, they all come to the same conclusion. And this should not be a politically complex question, often is, but you always come to the fact that you want a 20% give or take base load to balance the grid, to make sure that the cost of the whole system, not just somebody's rooftop, is actually reasonable. That's where fusion fits in complementing photovoltaics, wind, and other clean energy sources. Right now, we're in a world where the energy transition has barely started. We're barely adding energy capacity. Much of the world is energy starved. And so the philosophical point of, but why don't we just do photovoltaics, is very theoretical. And I think kind of misses the point of we just need more clean energy. David, happy if you add to that as you feel fit.
I completely agree, Francesco. I have yet to meet somebody in the fusion sector who is anti-renewables, generally speaking, and certainly on a near-term time frame, because as we've mentioned, we're not going to be powering the world from fusion in the next 5 years or 10 years, and there's a lot of climate imperative for decarbonizing the grid on that time frame anyway. And even longer term, generally, the view that Francesco described, namely that there's a good complementarity between kind of energy dense, firm sources of clean power on the one hand, and more possibly cheaper, but less firm, less controllable, and less dense form of power, like wind and solar, that those go hand in hand as opposed to being in competition. Actually, I'll maybe take one related question since we're on the topic of the overall energy mix. One of our attendees asked the question of why does power density matter in a world where you could take up only about 1% of the globe's surface for solar, and then you'd have theoretically enough power generation for the whole world. I think the reason, again, I am a big proponent and fan of solar energy, but I think the answer to that specific question of why that doesn't solve all of our problems is a fewfold. One is the cost of the storage that goes with the solar, as Francesco mentioned. The second is that 1% of the world's surface is actually a lot of surface area. If you think about what the implications societally would be of kind of blocking that out. And then the third thing, crucially, is geographic distribution. The places that need power may not be the places that have the sun shining right now, or vast amounts of sun or wind at any given moment. And that is one advantage, not just of fusion, but of a few different energy sources that can be sited relatively anywhere. So maybe if I can take an additional question here. A few folks have asked about materials, and being a materials scientist, I get excited about that. I'm going to answer the question from broadly and try to tackle it from different perspectives. Generally, the question and set of questions about materials is really about, are materials, certain materials, going to be a bottleneck in the growth and viability of fusion? If so, is that a geopolitical bottleneck around some countries holding strategic materials? Is it a technical bottleneck? What are those materials, and so on and so forth? I would love to hear Francesco's answer to that as well, but I would say one area that is really interesting to follow and to keep paying attention to is tritium. So there, in the kind of mainstream leading approach to fusion, you're fusing two different isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium, which is very plentiful and not really hard to get a hold of, and tritium, which is naturally not occurring and therefore not easy to get a hold of unless you have a fusion power plant. It's produced as in the process of having a fusion power plant. So if you've got one plant, you can start making tritium for your second plant, and so on and so forth. Your ability, how much extra tritium your plant makes dictates how quickly you can grow your fleet of power plants. Either way, in principle, any given fusion power plant is at least self-sustaining, and again, producing hopefully some extra to build the next one or the series of next ones. But you obviously have a kind of cold start problem where at the beginning you need to have some, and you need to make sure that extra tritium is being produced fast enough and can be stored and transported safely and fast, and without geopolitical considerations that may limit the kind of spread of tritium and therefore of fusion energy. Right now, there's enough tritium stock on Earth to power, to start off the fusion industry. That should not be a problem. But there are many scenarios in which that could go awry for a variety of reasons. So it's worth watching. It's worth watching beryllium, which is an element that is important in the fusion blanket of a number of concepts, and is a relatively scarce element today. There's reason to believe that once people start looking for beryllium, there will be plenty more. Right now, people have not really been looking, but it's worth knowing that as an element, there's just not a lot of beryllium accounted for today. And then really the next big category of materials that I would point out are, again, the plasma-facing materials, the structural materials, and so on and so forth, that simply just have either not been invented and developed today, or certainly have not reached the kind of scale of manufacturing and the certification and qualification and so on that will be required for a real mature industry. And people in the industry know that. What I wish were true and is not quite true is that the material science community does not necessarily fully know that. And those are obviously the folks that we need working very intensely on this exciting new area of science and engineering.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that. Some of the concerns that you were saying, David, they clearly point to some big questions on the engineering side, maybe worth highlighting in the case of magnetic confinement fusion with these donuts, tokamaks or stellarators. There will always be physics questions, but those are not the ones that are actually holding us back right now. We have questions about tritium breeding. We have questions about material bombardment by neutrons at 14 megaelectron from fusion. These are the things that some of the constraints that we're now fighting against, let's say. So maybe to add on materials, actually first on tritium, I would say tritium is not a natural resource problem. It needs to be understood as a technology problem. And that means the question of is there enough tritium is oftentimes misunderstood. There isn't enough tritium because it decays. So by definition, if you don't make it, it will not be there in a few years. But we have been working as a fusion community on tritium concepts. Those are still low technology readiness level. There is no reason to think that a tritium breeding blanket cannot be done. It is very much to be demonstrated that you can make one in a way that makes the device commercially viable. So that's the role of research and private companies working together today. And it's not a question that should be trivialized. It's an important one, and it's one where people are working. On materials being under bombardment by fusion neutrons, that's another exciting field. In a paper like the one that Proxima published with its partners, the Stellaris paper, there is an assumption on a low activation, high strength steel, which has been produced in large quantities. But those large quantities, you shouldn't imagine that we've built entire ships with that. But we have a manufacturing process. This is a well-characterized kind of steel. So it offers a baseline, let's say, where you can make a design with it and not feel like you're speculating. We know that this can definitely be produced in large quantities. There just needs to be the demand to actually make it. Unless there is demand, nobody cares to make this steel in large quantities. There are also materials that are not assumed in the Stellaris paper that could actually change the commercial viability of fusion by a lot. So if you thought about making a vanadium-based blanket structure, you could get magic to happen in economic terms. That vanadium material in large quantities does not exist today. So it's, I think, totally fine for a fusion company to say, if and when that material will appear, we will do so and so. Today, that's definitely in the R&D space. Voilà, there is also another question on deuterium and tritium we kind of answered. Maybe I'll answer an extra one, which I see has a thumbs up from somebody else. So to the audience, feel free to put thumbs up on questions that you'd like to see answered. One that is directed to me, I guess, is how is the shape of the stellarator superior to the simple torus that CFS is pursuing? Maybe describing it as simple. The simple doesn't apply to very much in fusion, but yes, the stellarator shapes that Proxima is pursuing with the Max Planck are objectively more complicated. As I said, the design and the manufacturing are all more complicated. The benefit is that you're looking at, in a stellarator, a device that can operate in continuous operation. So it's steady state. It's not a pulse device. When you think about a gas power plant, you're thinking about a device that provides baseload in a continuous manner. The CFS guys would frame a tokamak as a device that can go up and down. So up, steady, and then down, and then repeat. And that the average power would still be compelling from a commercial perspective. Proxima instead is targeting a concept that goes up and stays up for, ideally, in the nth of a kind, a 90% availability for a power plant. That's what we're targeting, let's say. So the steady state nature of a stellarator is definitely interesting. The other part that is maybe even more important to me as an ex-tokamak physicist, I switched sides from doing research on tokamaks to becoming a fan of stellarators, mostly because of the intrinsic stability. So tokamaks have a large current in the plasma that can lead to current-driven instabilities. And those instabilities need to be dealt with in some way. And a tokamak company like CFS has a strategy to deal with that. It is a personal opinion at this stage whether those instabilities can be managed in a power plant. Obviously, the CFS team thinks that they can. Proxima is based on a different belief in what will turn out to be the best path for a power plant. We believe that a steady state, intrinsically stable device, so one that works like a microwave oven. If you design it right, you manufacture it right, you can ramp it up and it just runs. We believe that that is a better power plant. I pause on that.
No,
David,
that
do you
was
have
great.
another question?
Sure, if I have time really quickly. Scott Hanna has asked a great, or actually, no, this was David Herman asked a great question about social acceptance that feels worth capturing as well. Social acceptance will be crucial for Fusion in my mind. I think Fusion has a good head start. It sounds kind of cool. People are generally favorably inclined about it. But again, it's not a real thing for people to have an opinion about quite yet. And there's very much the risk that the fusion industry, I think, needs to be very aware of fusion becoming a lightning rod topic for no real technical reason, except in the same way that vaccines have. In addition, there are real factors that the fusion industry has to be aware of and be upfront about, so that we don't end up in a situation where the public feels cheated, if you will. We've talked about tritium. We have talked a little bit, or we've alluded to neutron activation of materials that are kind of like close to the heart of the plasma phasing system. We've alluded a little bit to beryllium, which can be a toxic element as well. These are things that exist in a lot of fusion concepts, and handled well should not pose a problem, but they bear some amount of inherent risk, and it's worth certainly being on top of them, but also being upfront with them, so that the public doesn't end up feeling like there was some kind of cover-up, if you will. So that would be my recommendation to the fusion leaders out there.
Absolutely fabulous. Thank you, guys. We're coming to the end of our hour, and we like to be prompt about things if we can be. I'd like to remind people that these folks are fellow alums. They are in the directory. They can be contacted. There's a lot of stuff going on in this space that I hope you folks will keep an eye on. And it's been a pleasure having you folks here. And our website will try and keep track of this. We can take news like this from any alum who's entered in. Whether or not it gets up on the website or not is a matter of sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But we're happy to sponsor more discussions and more webinars on these kinds of things. We're always looking for webinar issues to raise and to find alums who are doing this kind of work. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Moana and Sam for helping us put this up, and especially David and Francesco. It has been an absolute pleasure having you here. It's fascinating to hear this. I'm very excited about the work that is being done on this. From hearing Commonwealth Fusion talk about some of the problems they've faced, I thought that their 2031 contract with Google for producing 300 megawatts was a pretty sure thing. I'm not so certain about the timeline on that anymore. But thank you so much, Francesco, David, and we'll see you guys at some point in the future. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day, folks.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everybody.